Hello and welcome to this week's episode of Growing Guelph. As always, I'm your host, Jordan Sloggett. This week I sat down with local Guelph journalist Adam A. Donaldson. Adam is the creator and founder of Guelph Politico, a website dedicated to covering political news here in Guelph. He also writes for guelphtoday.com as their City Hall columnist and co-hosts a political and current affairs show on CFRU 93.3 called Sources Guelph, as well as a movie review show called End Credits. Adam and I talked all things local politics, the state of politics coverage in general, what local news means, and more. I really enjoyed this conversation with Adam, and I hope you enjoy listening to it. As always, thanks for downloading. Thanks so much for joining me today,
Thank
Adam.
you for having me. I always love being on other people's shows.
Yeah, like you were saying, less tech stuff for you to worry about, right?
Yeah, I can just walk in and sit down and let other people set up, and they ask the questions, and yeah, it's a refreshing change.
Mm-hmm. Well, I'm happy to give you that opportunity. And maybe to start things off for any of our listeners who aren't aware of you and what you do, could you just share a bit about your professional background and what led you to focus your career on like local journalism here in Guelph, and then maybe you can kind of just go into a little bit about what that career kind of currently consists of and some of your outputs.
It wasn't a plan. So yeah, I do Guelph Politico, which is my local. I call it a news and politics site. It's not like news. Like I don't go to car crash scenes and chase the police scanner. I try to focus on like political and policy stuff. So I go to city council meetings and I try to cover some of the local boards like the Grand River Conservation Authority and the police board and these sorts of things. So very much on the policy side of the news. Along with that, I do a newsletter. I do a weekly podcast where I talk to interesting people around Guelph, whether they're political or an activist, or I once did a podcast with the Guelph Spider-Man, so it's not all political. And then along with that, I do two shows that are on CFRU, but also are released as a podcast version. End Credits, which is a movie show, and Open Sources Guelph, which is another political show, though it's more broadly provincial, national, international, with some like local interviews. Like we tend to focus on the big ones. I'm using scare quotes, the big ones, so like the mayor and our MP and our MPP and the city councilors, just to fulfill sort of public service ideas at CFRU as a community radio station, using that as a platform. How did I get into it? I guess it starts at the University of Guelph. I had two modes, work and school. I thought I should broaden my horizons. I, like a lot of people 20 years ago, picked up the paper copy of the Ontarian. Mm-hmm. And, they advertised, volunteer meetings every Thursday. There's no journalism program at U of G, so the paper is entirely idiosyncratic and people from all walks of all majors, participate in it. So everyone was welcome. So I went to a meeting. I started picking up stories, and I became a staff member. I was editor-in-chief for a year, and then I parlayed that into doing freelance stuff, and eventually, that became a website in 2008 called the Guelph By-Election 08 blog, which was a 6-week project. It became a 12-week project because a by-election turned into a full-blown general election in 2008, and then that became Guelph Politico.
So it was like a slow transformation. That's interesting. I wrote at the Ontarian as well when I was going to school there. And I was a science major. And it was kind of just like an opportunity for me to say like, I think I'm kind of good at the communication. I'm like less good at the math and stuff like that, but I like the communicating. So it was a fun way to get stories out there and that.
Yeah.
But I still pick up copies of the Ontarian, like when I see them around town, and it's fun to check out the articles, but it's
once a month now, which is
and it feels like I went to their website, tried to go to their website the other day. It was like down for reconstruction.
Yeah.
I wonder if they're facing some of the same bigger, it's almost like a societal issue of everyone's focus is so high level right now. It's on world events. It's on Canada as a whole. It's sometimes Ontario, but zooming in even on like their campus newspaper, I just don't know if that's where people's attention is. And because a lot of that finding out what's happening around campus is being fulfilled by things like social media, even though there's like a pretty wide gap even between a university newspaper and the standards that they have and just what is available to find and see on social media, right?
Yes.
Like there's no verification, there's no standards, there's no really anything to stop just misinformation and stuff just spreading.
Yeah, you may appreciate this, but like there was when I was at the Ontarian, we published between 10,000 and 13,000 issues a week for 13 weeks each semester, 13 or 14 weeks each semester. 4,000 of those went into the university center alone. Most of those were in two big bins at the front and at the back. And when the new edition came out on Thursday, everyone like getting on the bus, going into the UC every morning to get their coffee or whatever, or going to work if they work on the 4th and 5th floor, would like just grab a copy. It was like habit. I think that's one of the big issues now is this device here that I'm holding, the phone. It looks small, but it's a freaking fire hose that's throwing stuff at you, as you said, like from all over the world at any one time. And what is getting thrown at you is the stuff that is getting the most attention. The newspaper doesn't do that. The newspaper just sits there quietly and waits for you to like come on over and pick it up. And it's a very different mode of communication. And I think I've been thinking about a lot about this anyway. But I hear a lot from people who there's the Wellington Advertiser, but in terms of like Guelph publications, there's no Guelph newspaper anymore. And I hear from people all the time. It's like, I wish I could go to the corner store and pick up a newspaper. They tend to be, though, older people, retired people who have more leisure time and who come from that world and remember like you would sit down and read a newspaper. We haven't really invested in teaching younger people, being that kind of like active participant in the news, being like what they have grown up in and what they've experienced is being a passive participant, having the news thrown at you. Yeah. It's a very different behavior.
I think it's also people aren't, or at least I wasn't well educated in what are the ramifications if a local city council is able to essentially operate in the dark without any public eyes on them or any scrutiny, or the only thing that gets out to the public is their own news releases that then they just kind of copy and paste into articles. I think like growing up, like we learned about journalism and things like that, but the real importance of it was just taken for granted because we kind of thought, well, there's always going to be that scrutiny. And then for a while, I guess if we're talking about like where a lot of these changes come through, like I don't know when your tenure at the Ontarian was. Like I would have been volunteering there circa like 2009 to 2012 or so, and so that was right at the, I guess like the beginning ramp up of social media, right? Like Facebook had existed for a little bit. Phones were just kind of new. People were kind of transitioning from their BlackBerry to their smartphone, and we still had like a foot in both worlds. Like the newspaper was still a thing. I think the Guelph Mercury was still around at that time.
Yes, it was.
But there was a lot of talk about like, well, what is print's use in this new world where like people were feeling so connected and there was a lot of other positive things happening. It was Obama era politics. There was a lot of just like innate, like the world's good and we're all suddenly like using social media there was a lot of optimism. And then, since probably about, it didn't actually take that long after that. It was maybe like 2012, 2013 when we started seeing like the backlash against everything that brought with it. And I just think that people, they just take for granted that the local politics matters and the incentive structures of how that news gets to you. Cause like, the internet basically gutted so many of the monetary, like the ways that newspapers could provide for themselves, that journalists could provide for themselves, right?
There's a huge education gap that you're talking about. It's like on two levels. There's a huge gap on the civic side, so understanding how government works and who's responsible for what. And you see a lot of that in, like we're sitting here on day 2 of a federal election. There was a provincial election a couple of weeks ago, and there were so many people, and I heard a lot of people discussing this who were like, yes, I'm so great. I'm so happy we're having an election. I'm going to vote out Trudeau. Well, Trudeau doesn't have anything to do with the province of Ontario. He's the federal prime minister. So there's a fundamental misunderstanding, and I see that every week at city council too. And somebody comes forward, there's a lot on their street, a big green and white sign goes up and says this bungalow that's been around since 1987 is being torn down. It's going to be replaced with a 12-unit 3-story apartment building. You can't do that. Well, there's very little reason for city council to reject an application like that if it fits with all the planning standards, and there's the Places to Grow Act and population targets, the official plan, the zoning bylaw. It's just a lot. For just the basic entry into participating in politics requires you to do a lot of background research. And then the other part of it is that media literacy you're talking about. How do you tell the difference between something I do as opposed to Mayor Guthrie, who does video recaps of city council meetings, and I've seen him do like YouTube interviews with different people. And like you could make the point he is doing journalism, and I would never argue he shouldn't do that. But I think you have to, if you're someone in the general public, and you're like, well, I know what happened at city council because I watched Mayor Cam's video.
You know what Mayor Cam wants you to know?
Yeah,
and that's not to say
right.
that might not
and also his
with
point
the
of
truth.
view of what happened too. And Mayor Guthrie's very good at selling his point of view as the correct point of view. I'm not saying that's good, bad, or indifferent, but he has a point of view. I have a point of view too, but I do wonder how many people can't or don't distinguish between getting news from the mayor and getting news from the people in the press box like me.
Yeah. I mean, you're right. And that's the media literacy of it all, where there's bigger things. Like, not only is there's not just like news and then people who have a vested interest. There's the news that you're getting, what's their vested interest. Because there's like just the other day, I was on YouTube. The front page of my YouTube was recommending me a live, like I watch a fair bit of news on YouTube. So it was recommending me live news from a channel called like CNN News 17. I think they used the CNN logo, but not related to CNN at all. And they had this weird looping video of Carney talking from like Friday. And it had been live for like 2 days.
Right.
And it was just like, oh, like with that and like with the AI voice synthesis, like you have to be so careful when you click on something that even if you think you're seeing the words come out of someone's mouth, they might not be. And then even if it is the words, like, well, what was said right before that and after that? Like, what was the context of what it was? How is it being teed up to you? Is there spooky music in the background? Like, there's so much that goes into it that's like, whether or not you're informed, are you informed or are you misinformed? Like,
I mean, that's the most seditious version of that. I mean, there is like this straight up like regular flavor YouTube news where it's like two people on a microphone gabbing at each other, showing clips from like TV news, and then showing the clip and then going, "Can you believe it?"
Yeah.
And I'm not saying that isn't journalism. I mean, it's certainly commentary. It's certainly analysis. But like so much of YouTube news is that. Yeah. Just like, I mean, a lot of cable, there's this weird parasitic relationship. If you watch like CTV or CNN or CBC, like a lot of it is like, we're reporting that the Toronto Star is reporting, or we're reporting that the New York Times is reporting. It's, I mean, that's kind of how this has always worked, is that the newspapers are kind of the front line because it's the ink-stained wretches digging into files and doing the shoe leather. They don't have to be on TV all day. So
is that their preferred type? Ink-stained wretches?
Ink-stained wretches is a I mean, I'm not ink-stained because I don't work with, I mean, I work with pens, but certainly not printing presses. But that there has always been that. But when you go on a lot of the socials, and YouTube is really bad for this especially, and a lot of YouTube is driven by anger. You see that even with movie reviews. It's like, this is the worst thing I have ever seen. Yeah. And it's like some random Jason Statham movie or whatever it is, and that seems to be the driving thing. It's being mad about the news, being mad about the movies, being mad about anything, and that's.
I think we've really seen how that, like, the tendency towards the most polarizing opinion that you can get in front of people. It's leading everyone to think that we live in the worst times that have ever existed, and
yes,
there are. I don't want to say there are arguments for that, but I don't think people have the perspective to really just know that, like, when you turn on the news, they don't tell you 14,000 healthy babies were delivered today.
No.
They don't tell you, like, this number of people finished their cancer treatments.
We don't report on the planes that land.
Yeah, exactly. We don't report on the charities that just do good, boring work. The government programs, the non-government programs, the people who go out of their way. Like, all of that is just, like they say, like, if it bleeds, it leads.
Yes.
And we just, I think, sometimes fail to take that into perspective because we live in such a big world that there is a lot of potential bad news to take in, but that doesn't tell you really, like, that doesn't put your finger on the pulse of what's happening.
Well, we also don't take into account that when you hear a story, that may be the beginning of the story. We saw this a lot during COVID. I think a lot of the culture shock of COVID was that we were used to science having the answer on demand. And COVID was something scientists were learning about in real time as we, the public, were learning about it in real time. So there's this kind of like accidental undermining of the efficacy of science because we were watching them learn stuff. And now we look back and they're like, well, they really screwed up. And it's like, well, no, they didn't screw up. They were making recommendations based on the best information they have at the time.
Yeah.
But that's also the news. It's, that, I mean, it was credited to the publisher of the Washington Post, so I don't think he actually said it, that, the news is the first best rough draft of history. And, one story does not tell you the whole story.
Right. That's what I mean. I always kind of like to balance my news intake and a little bit of what's happening now just to have awareness, but then also like, okay, you have to give air to the journalists that are doing the deep dives, the stories that can't come out till 3-6 months later, because it takes a long time to do good work.
Yes.
And it's, I mean, I can, I guess just being like a science major in that, I can resonate to what you're saying about people having trouble during the pandemic because they were sort of seeing the process of science.
Yes.
And so many people, they only ever see the, I guess, like the engineering side of science, where they're like, these are the products, these are the conclusions, and they don't really know what the process of science is like, and they don't know that it's, scientists are some of the people who are most willing to admit like what we don't know and the uncertainty, and it's all about that uncertainty, and it's not like, they're not salespeople, they're not trying to sell you on this is the way the world is, versus so much of the rest of the world kind of operates on that salesman-y confidence sort of thing.
Like everyone has a hustle now, which
Yeah.
it feels like is part of the problem. There was a great documentary about flat earthers called Behind the Curve. And in it, there's a scientist it's at a local pub somewhere at a college town, and they're doing like these little TED Talks, and this one guy gets up and he says, like, we should be inviting flat earthers into science because they have shown that they are willing to question orthodoxy. They are clever because some of them are like designing experiments to try and prove the earth is flat. A lot of them incidentally prove that it's round, but they are willing to do the work. And he said, like, these are like disadvantaged scientists. We should invite them in, give them the tools, show them how the proverbial factory works. And I think a lot of that applies to our current information space as well. We have a lot of people who are very passionate, who want to know who is responsible, how this works. And I think that is something, I mean, I sometimes forget it. I've actively tried not to, because I've gone to like anti-mask and conspiracy theory protests where people like have these deeply held beliefs. And I've tried to go in non-judgmentally. And I think for the most part, I mean, there are flim-flam people who are like actively trying to exploit the anger and distrust, but the vast majority of these people just want answers.
Yeah.
And I think that's where we fall down. I've
spent a good portion of my professional career working in agriculture, marketing, and comms. So I think I can see the parallels to that, where I try to remain like, give people the benefit of the doubt, because I've seen sort of like, I don't come from a farming background, but when you work in those sorts of things, you work with a lot of people who are like kind of diehard, grew up on farms, and they can have, not all of them, but they can have a perspective that sees the like anti-GMO, anti-big farm people as just like, wackadoodle conspiracy. Yeah. And they kind of see it as a us versus them. And they focus on the people who, they might call the professionals who are in that world on that side. But like that sentiment of people just being concerned, it's because like, well, the world's changed a lot. People aren't familiar with their food. They don't work on farms. They don't know what happens there. They're told, like, they're inundated with fear about what's in their food. Yeah. So it kind of makes sense for them to be concerned. And that level of concern, like you said, it's just people who are interested and curious. And then sometimes that interest and curious, if it's not combined with, I won't say the right knowledge, but if it's not combined with the technical background of how to actually find the answers to things, then sometimes those people are led down the routes of conspiracy theory and maybe things that aren't as well grounded in science. But then there are good nuggets of things that we should be careful of, cautious of, and have like shine a light on that just gets grouped into that camp and then ignored because it becomes a one side versus the other. And now neither side is able to come to the table to like debate because they're both just focused on the extremes on either, like that polarization.
That's right. And I think it's part of it is recognizing when somebody else is right. And I went to one anti-mask protest and I was talking to a guy, he's a bit on the older side, and he says, I don't trust government. I don't trust big pharma. And I'm like, yeah, no, that's right. You shouldn't trust government. You shouldn't trust big pharma. But the flip side of that too is when, like, there's this old commercial for toothpaste, like 4 out of 5 dentists recommend this toothpaste. Well, the 5th dentist wasn't recommended you brush your teeth with candy floss.
Yeah.
He was recommending another toothpaste. So where do you find that sweet spot between, no, this is correct, you should, as someone once said, trust but verify. But when you get the answer, and I mean, this speaks to that documentary about the flat earthers, the filmmaker is following this guy who's doing an experiment where he has these 2 pillars set up and a laser pointer set far enough away that, you know, it shows the curve of the earth. And he's doing this experiment. He's like, we're going to prove that the earth is flat. We're going to show them. And he actually, in the process, ends up proving that, no, the earth is round. There's this moment where he's like, huh, that's interesting. This is not the result I thought. I think that's the opening, right? Well, how do you then pivot to, maybe my bona fides are wrong. Maybe I need to rethink things. But then there's the thing you're talking about where everyone has to go to their corner. I'm on this side, you're on this side, and only one of us can win. Yeah. Well, what if we can all win? Do we? I mean, I'm not sure. I've gone to these protests where I had people like saying to me, "It's about respecting my rights, and I have the right not to wear a mask." And I'd say, "Sure, but do you have a responsibility to wear a mask? Like, we're in a society together. I'm wearing a mask to look out for your health. You wear a mask to look out for my mouth. Are we not responsible for each other?" And they'd go, "Huh, that's interesting." Because they're so focused on the winning, they're not necessarily focused on the compromise.
Yeah. I find it's a similar situation if you get down to people who maybe are on the libertarian side of like, don't tax me. Yeah. And then it's like, okay, sure. Everyone, like, obvious, like, it's just, it goes without saying that like people like their money and like the things that their money enables them to do.
I like money, sure.
And when you have to give some of that money away and then part of you feels like you're not getting what you want out of it, but then you also have to look around and say like, okay, well, do you ever need public roads? Do you ever going to use like, you know, like we live in a society and there's a benefit to contributing to that society, and this idea that you can just kind of take your ball and go home and like not contribute and not give back to it, or I don't know. I think it's a bit of the individualism run rampant of people just sort of thinking that they are islands and
that's always been there, right? But I feel like, again, our media diet has sort of is forcing us to extremes as well. I can see valid arguments in the libertarian argument, but I can also see valid arguments against it too.
Yeah,
but
no, I agree. I mean, like it's interesting when you explore other points of view with an open mind, because you can often walk away saying like, okay, I can empathize and I can understand where their thinking led them down those roads, because you'll like I won't say no one, but you'll very rarely find that it's just like hatred and anger. It's usually stemming from them doing what they think is best for everyone, even if their logic takes it to the point of like, well, a bit of a tough love attitude can make people stronger. And I think everyone can agree that that can be true for individuals, but it's just, does that mean that if you apply that to an entire society that like,
I think we focus on like the 1 or 2% whose minds will like never, ever, ever, ever be changed. Because what I see, and I see this at city council a lot, people come with like a head of steam about this issue, whether that's like the lot down at the end of the block or the public space use bylaw, whatever it is. And what I found to be true in like 98% of cases is, number one, people just want to be heard. Mm-hmm. Which is why I've petitioned for, like, we should have one city council meeting where all 13 of them sit there, and then it's an open it's open mic at city council. You come up and you get your 5 minutes to stand on the soapbox and talk about you want to. So just,
I'm ignorant of city council. Yeah. I would have and this is just from going off of like the tropes that I know about city council meetings and media, but I would have thought that sort of was the case.
No, it's very stolid, and like they have the agenda. You have to talk to what's on the agenda. You have to sign up in advance. I mean, there is an exception in the case of planning meeting where if it's what's called the statutory planning meeting, where it's like a zoning bylaw change, like let's say you sold your house, somebody else buys it, they want to put, I don't know, this lot isn't big enough, but let's say they want to put a 9-story apartment building here instead. That would constitute a zoning bylaw change. The planner would have to bring a plan to the city staff. The city staff would bring it to council, and they'd have this what's called a statutory planning meeting, where they lay out what the developer wants to do with this site.
Right.
And then council receives that as information. No final decision is made, and then it comes back after council's had further back and forth with the developer about firming up their plans.
Okay.
But yeah, it's very prescriptive. You have to talk to what's on the agenda. You can't just like, I'm at a city council meeting, I want to talk about how there's no good food trucks in Guelph or something like that.
So it's not the stereotype, if people are familiar with, like Parks and Recreation, the TV show where they have to sit through just endless lineups of people just getting up on their soapbox and wanting to talk at them about whatever.
Yeah, there are town halls where obviously it's about, you can go and ask your city councilor things, and that's a kind of a different beast. But like the formal static city council meetings, you have to go and talk about what's on the agenda. So yeah, in people want to be heard. And then the other thing is kind of once people understand what's going on, what the process is, like when you answer the 5 W's, who, what, when, where, why, how, people go, okay, now I know. Because it's the information vacuum that I think makes people more reactive than they'd like.
Yeah. And you're saying earlier about how people who don't trust these big institutions, but it's always the nebulous, like shadowy, what they don't know. And if you were to, like, I'm sure if, they lived in the city long enough and maybe one of their city councilors lived in their neighborhood and they met them, like the more you shine a light and the more you really understand, the more you'd be like, okay, yeah, I know that person. And then maybe over the course of 20 years, you'd kind of know the push and pull, but you'd get the dynamics of it all. And it'd be a lot harder to just insert like a shadowy corporate entity behind the scenes that is pulling the strings. And I think that's sort of true of, it's certainly true. Like we talk about, don't trust pharmaceutical companies, and like, that's true. And at the end of the day, like pharmaceutical companies are probably also made up of a lot of people, each trying to make the right decision, but then the incentives of making money and things like that. It's just like a lot of things are way more complicated when you get into it than
things are more complicated. Yeah. Like people hear pharmaceutical company, they think of the CEO who's making millions of dollars and has stock options and owns 5 houses. They're not thinking about the guy who makes $100 million, or not $100 million, $100,000 just doing his job as a middle manager. Most companies, most governments for that matter, are middle managers.
Yeah.
And this is one of the windmills I tilt at too, is like the Sunshine List. Like so many people look at the Sunshine List and it gets bigger every year, and they go like, these fat cats living high off the hog, making $100,000. Well, I think we all appreciate $100,000 doesn't go as far as it did. And if they were keeping up with inflation, $100,000 in 1995 when they started doing this reporting is now like $167,000. So the list doesn't actually grow in terms of like people who are quote unquote high on the hog.
Yeah. I mean, theoretically, there will come a point where minimum wage would get you 100,000. Yes. And if that sounds crazy to anyone listening, like look up what the average salary was in like the 20s or something. Yes. Like the numbers will astound you because that's inflation. Like that's how it works, right? So,
and I've tried to do that too. It's like it's not about how much they make. It's not about why do they make so much. It should be about why do you make so little. If you work 40 hours a week and you can't have a good life, like you can't have a place to live that's affordable and that fits the size of your family, whether that's you and the 2 kids or you and the wife and the 2 kids or you and grandma and the 2 kids and the dog or whatever it is. You can't afford groceries. You can't have a nice car, just one nice car, or can't afford to like take the family to Canada's Wonderland on the weekend. I mean, that doesn't speak to the fat cats. That speaks to, well, I mean, it kind of does speak to the fat cats, but it speaks to what we value. And I saw this a lot when the previous provincial government raised the minimum wage. There were so many people who were angry. It's like, well, why should somebody who works at Walmart make $15 an hour?
Yeah. Like, why should someone who works at Walmart deserve to not struggle is kind of what they're saying.
Right.
In some ways, or at least that's an inverse way of phrasing it.
And it's like, well, if you work 40 hours a week, why are we saying you should make less because of where you work?
Yeah. And then that's where people zoom into the individual, where they're saying, well, people should educate themselves, and it's like, okay, yes, that is good advice for any individual. However, shouldn't minimum wage, like if someone's working
we can't all be lawyers and doctors.
Yeah, exactly. That's the other thing is there's always going to be people making a certain amount, and if you're trying to condemn them to like, well, you're working a poor person's job, so you deserve to live in squalor, and it's like, okay, well, and then you're right. No one on the Sunshine List is by definition like part of the, I guess, the capital class, and we have this obsession with like the middle class, an invention of the 20th century that previous to that, we understood society as really just being like an upper class with some like middle manager, the people who have to like, they work and they're the rulers, but they're still the workers. And then everyone else who's just certain time it would have been like the peasants, or then just the workers, like the people who don't own any of the means of production.
Yeah.
And they rely on, and all of the work comes from them.
Yeah.
And then in like the modern sense, like people really like with the Sunshine List, it's like, well, those people are working and doing a salary, and you could argue about if whatever position is overpaid, but like they're not the ones just sucking up all the capital to the very top as owning everything. Like they work for those people.
Sure.
You probably work for those people too.
Yeah.
They're just like 2 rungs higher than you on the ladder.
Yeah.
But you can't see the people way up on the ladder, so people get very focused on who's above me and who's below me, and that's where the blame gets shared, and the people way above are just happy to let everyone else fight that battle.
There's such a fascinating historical context. I was listening to a podcast on the weekend, and somebody was saying, like, in the 20th century, we came to see, after World War II, we came to see, like, working in a factory is a really great job. Before that, like at the beginning of the Industrial Revolution, like working in a factory was a horrible job.
Yep.
It was like unsafe conditions, working like tireless hours, working next to children in some cases. Like
they didn't have a concept of a weekend.
There's no weekend. Yes.
OSHA, any worker safety things. Like, do you think you could refuse unsafe work? Like, no. Like there was all of the worker protections, the weekend, the 40-hour work week, EI, like all of these things were fought for, and
they were all seen as like far left, borderline communistic ideals.
Exactly, but then it's kind of like the whole thing, like anything that's new. It's like an old Douglas Adams quote where it was. This is about technology, but it was basically saying like anything that existed before you were born is just a natural way of things. Anything invented before the age of 40 is cool and exciting, and you can probably get a job doing it. And anything invented after the age of 40 is just not quite right, and maybe like a little bit too new and too whatever.
Yeah.
And I think people have that same view when it comes to the progress of like workers' rights and things, where there was a time in the 20th century where people predicted like, well, if we keep making these gains in efficiency in 40, 50, 60 years, people could work 20-hour weeks and get by. And that's not what happened at all. If anything, people work longer hours and they work like, I mean, there's just
the goal of technology was we'd have more leisure time.
Yes.
But what's the weird thing that's happened is the more technology we have, the less, and you see this in the Silicon Valley ethos of like, Elon Musk, who's like, no, I don't go home at the end of the day. I just pop a cod in my office and sleep for 3 hours, and then I get right back to it.
Yeah.
And, when you think about the Jetsons ideal, George Jetson goes to work. He's like the only guy. It's essentially like him and Spacely Sprocket, his boss. Like they're the only 2 people at this massive company.
I remember and I remember even being a kid being like, oh, this is funny that like the prediction of the future, because he even talks like his workday is like 2 hours long. He works 3 days a week. His job is pressing a button at the Sprocket factory or whatever. And like
And then he goes home to his robot maid in his house in the clouds and his flying car.
Yeah, exactly. And it's like, yeah, that was just a 50s or 60s like parody of it, but there was something to that. And
Yeah.
I think there's a quote, I'm not going to get the quote right, it might have been just a headline, but it was Jeff Bezos talking about how he likes when his workers are afraid. Like he wants people who are fearful.
Yeah.
Because then they're motivated.
Yeah.
And
owner of the Washington Post, Jeff Bezos.
Yeah.
Or his workers are definitely afraid there, I think.
Well, I feel like I've only asked you one of my questions, and we've been off on a tangent, but I do want to get to
more
of like what you do. So, Guelph Politico, which we've talked about a few times.
Yes.
I think it's become like a leading, like one of the leading sources for in-depth civic coverage in Guelph.
Thank you.
And what was the original vision behind launching it? And you kind of spoke to that at the beginning, but maybe you could speak to how that vision has shifted or sharpened over the years.
I mean, the vision, as I said, was like I was writing a column about Guelph stuff in Echo Weekly, which was an alt weekly that was in town. I think it shuttered in 2012, unfortunately. And so there was a by-election on. We were getting all this attention because I think we were one of 3 ridings undergoing a by-election at the time. So we had party leaders coming to town. We had Jack Layton was here several times. Elizabeth May, she was the new leader of the Green Party at the time, coming here several times. Stephen Harper did a rally. Stephen Dion came to town a couple of times. I actually did a sit-down interview with Stephen Dion, which was, I mean, again, we're in an election now. If Mark Carney does come to town, I guarantee you there's going to be no sit-down interviews with the media, but that's neither here nor there. So it just, I had all this extra material, so I started a blog. Mm-hmm. And then I guess I had such a great time doing it. I just like kept it going, just posting whatever. And there were like municipal elections, and so I'd like send candidate questionnaires, and it was just sort of like piece by piece by piece. And like in around 2015, this was almost right before the Mercury closed. I was like, well, what if I went to city council and just like tweeted everything that happened? And that seemed to be a hit. I started doing the podcast more regularly. It's like, and this was kind of born out of like, I hate transcribing interviews. This was kind of before like voice memos, or like there were easier ways to do it now. And so I was just like, what if I just stuck the whole interview online as a podcast? And that, that's another piece of it that fell into place. And then it was just like kind of getting into the rhythm of going to council meetings every week, getting people onto the podcast and posting that every week. And then it kind of took off and became its own thing. And I've added things as I go, like trying to take video of announcements and things and protests. And I have a whole backpack. I have what I call a studio in a backpack, where it's like an old iPhone I have that I use for video, and my Zoom microphone and my Zoom recorder and 2 cameras. And yeah, it's I just sort of, whatever works with people, I kind of like. That's how I started covering like board meetings too. It's just like, this seems to be a gap that's missing. What if I filled that gap? Again, there's really no plan to this, but over the course of almost 20 years now, I appreciate what you said about me being a leading voice in the civic realm. I feel like I have collected all this like institutional knowledge of Guelph that is kind of like useful to the city, but makes me utterly useless everywhere else in the world.
Does that make you feel like
I'm such an
trapped?
expert on
Like you're trapped in the city?
A little.
Yeah. Did you grow up in Guelph?
No, I grew up in Georgetown.
Okay. And then you came here for school?
I came here for school.
Okay. So you're like kind of like me, where the sucked in for school and then the city won you over, and I guess.
Yeah. I think that's a lot. I think that's a common story.
Yeah.
That maybe we don't appreciate it. I know there's a lot of consternation, let's call it, about how quick Guelph is growing, but I mean that has been a story for years. Yeah. I know so many people who came to the University of Guelph and then never left.
Yeah.
Or left begrudgingly because they got a better job somewhere else. Or
it's also interesting. So when I moved back to the city in like 2020, and I got really into
interesting year.
Yeah, well, it was I got laid off from my job in Toronto. I got a new remote job. Suddenly, I didn't have to live in Toronto. My wife and I were like, maybe we should buy our first house, and couldn't afford Toronto. Guelph could not have afforded this house like 6 months after I bought it.
That's right,
because of the housing market. So I'm one of those people who's like, yes, houses should be affordable, and also like, maybe I'll have to take that hit to make that happen, and like, whatever. I think that living in a world where people could have houses is better than living
Sure.
just like I get to benefit.
Yeah.
But in any case, I got into some local history. I started diving at, like, this house was built in 1875, so I got into like who lived in this house, and I ended up just getting local books from the library. And it's interesting when you read city history, because like the city of Guelph has gone through big transformational changes and big waves of different immigrant populations.
Yes.
And when we look back on it, it's easy to just be like, yeah, the city grew and this new neighborhood developed, but like, what was that like at the time? And was there that same, like, if I went to a resident of downtown Guelph in like 1920 or something like that, like, would I hear similar things about like, there's way too many people coming into the city, we can't support it, the city's growing out of control in this direction? Like,
Yeah.
I don't know if the talking points were the same, but I don't know. I think like growth and things like that, like, people don't like seeing their hometown change from what they remember it as a kid.
I think that's right. And I think there is always, I think you're right. If you go back in time, probably right back to 1827 and some of the local indigenous people seeing
I mean, you're right.
group
Shame
of
on
white
me
guys shit cut down a tree and say, hey, we live here now.
Yeah. Look at this amazing place to live. How come no one's taking advantage of it? Like,
Yeah.
oh, God.
It's that's funny. No, I've kind of been aware of that on the periphery too. I think there's a group of people who are very politically influential in Guelph, who remember the 1990s very, very fondly, and are unwilling to accept that it's 2025 and that the city is like very, very different. I saw that last term with the redistribution of the ward system. We kept the 6-ward system and 2 part-time counselors per ward because I think the council at the time thought that worked very, very well. I don't know if that works better than the system that was proposed, which was 8 wards with 1 full-time counselor for each ward. What I do know is that where I live now in the South End, we keep adding like 10,000 more people to this massive piece of geography in the South End, still represented by 2 people who work part-time, as opposed to where we are right now in the center of town, which, because it's already built up, doesn't really change that much.
Yeah.
Also represented by 2 people and who work part-time. So there is this friction politically, as well as like actually like on the street, just in conversations with people, like, is Guelph changing too quickly, and what do we lose by, I guess, accepting that?
We also have such an interesting relationship to the past, where that's another thing of learning history is, when you look back at, like, we see it now as just buildings and history that we lost.
Yes.
But at the time, they did not view it that way. They viewed it as like, oh, to the heck with this old,
look at this old
60-year-old
crap
thing, and it's crumbling. Like, they were excited to build new things and to move forward, and it was seen as like progress. And now we have so much reverence for the past in some ways, and the reluctance to change and to move forward. And I think that's a healthy conversation to have. I don't think it would be good to just be in one camp or the other.
No.
But I guess it goes back to, are people willing to have that dialogue about the benefits of, like, for example, this house, it's built in 1875. I'm right near downtown Guelph. If at some point in the future it was demolished and a house with 3 different, like, 2-bedroom apartments could be built here,
Sure.
that would be good for the neighborhood.
Sure.
Would it be a loss of, like, something that's been here for a long time? Yeah, sure. But, like, also, it's not that precious of a thing. Like, I don't think the guy or people who built this house in 1875 would have had that precious view of it. To them, it was a place to live. It was also, I looked it up because in the census in like 1877 or something, the entire property and everything the guy owned who lived here was $800. So, like, I don't know what that was in perspective to what, like, someone could make in a year.
Yeah.
But I really doubt it was the multiplier that it would exist. Like, what I paid for the place versus the average salary in Guelph, like, I bet that multiplier is greater, much, much, much greater now than it was 150 years ago, when people just thought, like, it's a house, you have to live, and there's new houses being built everywhere. Like,
it's interesting. I've kind of heard this discussion at heritage meetings, where there are a lot of houses like this that are like old working class houses that are representative of a time and a place and how people lived. These don't tend to get the majority of the, let's say, eagerness for like heritage designation so much as like the old churches and the old factories. And
it also depends how it looks, right? Like the outside of this house has been redone with like some new stucco and that, so it doesn't, on first glance, you don't see it as looking at like 150 years old versus there's some old stone cottages like McTogg cottages right down the street on Woolwich, and they are like very celebrated in their heritage places, and they look like it from the outside, but it's just like the facade of the building on the outside. And then I don't know, there's other things too. I know where people get upset about like how houses are used in certain ways. I made the one day where I was looking through the heritage things on the city website, and I was like, the Sleeman Mansion. And I was looking at these photos, and I was like, where is this in town? Like, what is this? And it's the manor. Like, that makes sense. It's the manor. Like, it's now kind of not in a neighborhood anymore, and it's
well, it's still in a neighborhood. It used to be the edge of town. It used to be like out in the country.
Right.
It was
like an estate on the edge of town.
It was it was across the road from where the Sleeman plant was.
Right.
That big area on Silver Creek South was, I mean, it's been home to a couple of different businesses, but once upon a time it was home to the Sleeman bottling plant. This is before it was shut down because Old Man Sleeman liked to sell illicit booze to the Americans. But I mean, that's a tremendous piece of Guelph history, and I'm sure you've heard about the trolley system that took people from the center of Guelph out to the old Sleeman plant down Waterloo.
There were trolley tracks right in front of this house on Woolwich.
That's right.
You know, you could. That kind of blows my mind. That like the steps backwards that we view now as steps backwards. That at the time they were like, well, everyone can afford a car all of a sudden. Why? Yes. Like they were excited. They saw it as progress, as moving forward.
Yes. It's remarkable sort of what we value changes. I think everyone would love to hop on a trolley and go down Waterloo Avenue.
Yeah. Good luck to the city councilor people who proposed that and the massive increases to taxes.
I mean, that's the thing. It would cost an arm and a leg, and everyone would complain about the road construction. It'd probably take 2 years to install. And
I guess that's a good thing to remember too, is that when I said before how this house was valued at $800, like that was it wasn't hooked up to electricity. There was no sewer system.
Probably had an outhouse in the back.
Yeah, it probably it's a different world that we live in, and this society we have 3 different utilities. This house has gas, electricity, internet. It's just different. It's a completely different world.
Water,
yeah. Oh, water. I forgot about water. So I guess as we've talked about your various podcasts and things that you do, well, actually, let's give you that opportunity to talk through that. Where you have the Guelph Politico website. And you either are on or produce 3 podcasts a week?
The Guelph Politicast, which is part of Guelph Politico, and then the 2 shows, which I produce through CFRU and co-host, but are also, I put on the same podcast channel just for the name of efficiency. Yeah,
I don't blame you trying to manage multiple podcast channels. Sounds tricky. So evidently you wear a lot of hats.
I do. I like hats, yeah.
How do you manage all those platforms, and how do you, every moment that you're spending building out a platform, putting together posts, editing a show is you have to kind of balance how's your time spent.
Yeah.
Has that been a tricky process to learn and manage?
It's tricky. Yeah. I mean, sometimes they throw a wrench like an election into a snap election, let's call it. Again, that's the thing I learned at the Ontarian is the advantage of having the production line where Thursday is the meeting day and you lay out the stories. Friday is kind of a catch up, and
it gets you into a rhythm
of
the week, right?
Then you get Monday and the stories come in, and then you start laying out the paper, and then on Tuesday you're editing everything and laying it out, and then Wednesday you finish a lay and send it off to the printer. There was a mechanism to it, and I've tried to sort of adapt that to my work. It's I have a calendar on my computer that is this day is this the things I do every week, because there are things I can't anticipate, like snap elections, but I know that there's a Heritage Guelph meeting on this day. I know that this agenda comes out on on this Thursday, and it's very kind of regimented. But I mean, that's in order to like handle the chaos that swirls around, you kind of have to regiment it a bit. But yeah, it's kind of prescriptive, but I find that helps focus the mind as well.
This is a side question, but
Okay.
wondering how have you seen any like major shifts to the metrics of it all with the changes that Meta implemented of like removing Canadian news from all of their platforms?
I mean, yeah, it's I don't think Guelph Politico has been banned from Meta. I guess I'm not. It's weird. Open Sources is considered a media. It's a media site.
Yeah.
Guelph Politico is not, and I guess because that may be something I did. But I mean, yeah, the social media sites made a world where that's how you had to get your information out.
Yeah.
And then when they take it away, I mean, it's tricky, and I think this is where something like Substack is handy.
Some of the independent, I know like Blue Sky and things like that.
Blue
People
Sky,
talk about because they're not their structure of the organization isn't the same way that the different servers. Maybe I'm thinking of Mastodon. That's a different one, but
Mastodon is a different service.
Yeah.
Like Blue Sky was like the baby of Jack Dorsey, who created Twitter, where he was like, "What if I had Twitter, but it was like open source?"
Okay. So it still is focused on that idea
Yeah.
that like they're not gonna, aside from like the legal things, they're not gonna try to do what Meta's doing, where they're, I mean, even the idea of saying like we're not gonna allow news because like
the Meta thing is so weird because a lot of the tech stuff is weird because these, where we're talking about Bezos or Zuckerberg or Musk, like these guys are all like, we're disrupting the system and we're tearing it down, we're building something new, and then they build something new and they don't want to take any responsibility for it. And we see that with the Online News Act, where the Canadian government's like, okay, Meta, well, you're using our news sites for your content, you're gonna have to pay for that. And Mark Zuckerberg says, no, I'm not. And actually, it's gone on longer than I thought there would have been a relenting, but maybe that has to do with the sort of like the forces of things south of the border, that maybe Mark Zuckerberg doesn't think he has to relent to the Canadian government. But
yeah, well, I mean, it's frustrating how many young people get all of their or a huge portion of their news. Like I was going to say, at least there's a TikTok in the mix as one of the most popular apps that does allow people to talk through journalism and that. But like, how does that even work when it comes to journalism on a Meta platform? Because I'm not a journalist. They don't ban my content. If I go to a city council meeting and start live streaming it, when does it become Is it just like when it gets noticed enough and then they say, oh wait, this is news?
They're making a distinction. There's like this is news, this is not news.
Yeah, which is like when you really get into it, like what is news? Is a live webcam feed pointed somewhere in downtown Guelph, like by its definition that is information being shared about a thing. There's no context or anything else written to it, but like,
well, this has been the issue with...
If the mayor says what happens at city council, is that news? That's news.
That's a great point. That's a great point. And I think one of the issues with social media is that, and I'm not saying it's right and I'm not saying it's wrong, but I'm saying this is how it is. What I do is presented in the same way on Facebook and Meta and all these sites as what the Rebel does and what the Toronto Star does. And the three of us have very different methods, means, goals, needs.
Corporate
but
ownership.
When you're just scrolling through it on your app, it all looks the same. And I don't know how you fix that without saying, you're news, you are not news.
Yeah.
We're putting you on probation. You might be news, but you might not. I mean, I don't think that's a judgment that should be in the hands of any company or government.
Yeah.
But that gets into, well, then how do you tell the difference? Well, that's where learning media literacy comes into it.
I'm reminded by some, like, I remember activities in like even grade school, early high school that kind of talked about like the validity of sources. And even at the time there was ideas of like, oh, if it comes from a book, like that's trustworthy. And it's like, well, anyone can publish a book, and
now they can.
Publishers don't like that. That's probably like, it doesn't mean that it's not a good source. It just means that existence in a book doesn't mean anything.
Yeah.
Because someone could publish a book that could be very popular that could contain any number. Like there's nothing like verifying that what they put out there. And some people have that same thing with when it comes to news, right? Where they're like, well, it's I sent you a news article. And it's like, well, did you look at the website that this news article is hosted on? Have you ever heard of this before?
Yeah.
Like, do you look at the other articles that they publish? Like, it's not all news is news, and not all.
Well, the thing about books is like you can't even trust the New York Times bestseller list anymore. It's like this is a New York Times bestseller. It's like, well, is there an asterisk there? You look at the New York Times bestseller. There are books that have asterisks next to them. Why? It's because somebody is buying that book in bulk to give it away. So you're goosing the numbers, but still, if you're looking at a cover of a book and it says the New York Times best-selling, there's no asterisks there.
Yeah,
but the system is being gamed in a whole host of ways that I don't think people really appreciate.
Yeah, just made me think. Like we were talking about that. Is it news? Like if Canada had our equivalent of a Joe Rogan, at what point does that podcast become news? Because like Joe Rogan is news for millions of people, where it's how they find out information about the world.
Yes.
And
the thing is though, 20 years ago, people felt the same way about Jon Stewart and The Daily Show. People got their news from Jon Stewart and The Daily Show, but people didn't have as much. Maybe some people had a problem with it, but it wasn't as big of a deal because Jon Stewart was doing journalism.
Yeah.
He like with jokes, but it was journalism. Joe Rogan has complete and total crackpots, God bless him, come in and he goes, oh, that's interesting. And then maybe he's sometimes like, is that true? And then he has his producer off screen going, yeah, I just did 5 seconds of Googling and that turns out to be total horse pucky.
I mean, it's kind of, it's a hot button issue now to even like talk about, but I have enjoyed many episodes of Joe Rogan's podcast because, you know, prior to maybe like 2020 or when maybe he really fell off the rails into...
he can be engaging.
He can be engaging and he has interesting guests on and he's not like you were kind of... this goes back to the beginning of the conversation about how like some of the flat earther, like Joe Rogan's a huge conspiracy theorist. And
yes, he is.
It's interesting hearing someone who doesn't really have that knowledge and background, but wants to ask the simple questions. And sometimes he'd have good people on and it was fascinating to listen to that. And having that like, oh, he's going to have a 2.5 hour conversation about an expert and just sort of like, they're really just going to get into it. And like, that was new and that was interesting. And
I mean, it depends on sort of what your goal is. Like, is your goal to try and learn things? And if you are trying to learn things, you're going to ask like practical questions, like how do you know this? And that's going to expose stuff like I don't believe in guilty pleasures, but one of them is like the Ancient Alien show. And so much of that show is we don't know how this thing was built 10,000 years ago. And since we don't, it's aliens.
Yeah.
Obviously, it's aliens. We don't know how it was done, so it was aliens. It's like, well, whoa. You yada it from we don't know the answer to this question to saying, no, the answer is aliens. And I feel like that's every episode of the Joe Rogan Experience now. We don't know this, so it's aliens.
Except instead of aliens, it's now it's wokeism.
Or the deep state or wokeism. And I mean, and it's all these words that, you know, if you were to ask Joe Rogan, like, where does the word woke come from? Where does it come? Like, would he be able to talk about Lead Belly songs or you know, the revolution will not be televised and, you know, Whitey on the moon and like these things where like woke was like an expression, and especially in like black music in the mid-century. Like, I doubt it. It's just become a boogeyman word that, you know, to explain a world that is more complicated than people would want to admit. Yeah.
And if you try to get people, like I've had friends in that who use the word woke, and what do you mean by woke? And I think a lot of their definitions come down to, I don't know the name of the Supreme Court justice who had his definition of pornography, which was like, I don't know a definition for it, but I know it when I see it.
I know it when I see it.
And that's how people tend to react to the word woke, where they're like, well, it means something that's, again, like uncomfortably progressive on the left side or performatively leftist, or like, you know, you could ask 10 different people and you'll get 10 variations of what it means to them.
But it's fascinating talking about like how you look back at things in history, like in watching like the negative reaction to the young people protesting the war in Gaza. And it's like, well, like 60% of people think they're not helping. And then people start producing, well, let's look at these opinion polls from the 1950s and 60s where 60% of people thought the freedom riders weren't helping the cause of civil rights, or that Martin Luther King Jr. wasn't helping the cause of civil rights, or that the lunch counter protests. And we look at all these things now and go, those young people were brave and courageous and righteous, and they changed the world. that's not how they were looked at in the 1950s and
Yeah.
60s.
Yeah, that's the really interesting of how, I mean, even World War II in that it's become so of like simplified over time that like Nazism is just taken as like, oh, they're the most extreme bad guys that Earth has ever produced, so we can use them as a placeholder. But like, I'm sure you could read opinion pieces in national newspapers in the late 30s and maybe even early 40s that like, maybe not the early 40s, but at least the mid to late 30s that there were conversations and debates, and these things were not foregone conclusions. Like,
it's the Nazi history before World War II is so fascinating when Hitler rises up, because there was, there's a lot of resentment in Germany that had to do with like their treatment post World War I, and the depression hits them especially hard, and of course you get this communist fervor that rides up. It's the system that did this capitalist system, and they were gaining traction, and then Hitler comes up, that has this populist revolution, and so who do they pick on first? The communists. And there were so many people in the upper echelon of like German society who were like, this is great. It's going to be like the Nazis versus the communists. They're going to like, they're so busy fighting each other that, it'll all work out in the end.
Yeah. The culture war. And then
it was a culture war. It was such a culture war. That's right. We keep going on these tangents.
This is a common theme of the show. So, I mean, as we've kind of discussed, local journalism
can
be a tough gig, especially in an era where we're dominated by global news.
Yes.
Example, us here keep
talking.
We're getting pulled into the global news.
Past and present.
What keeps you motivated to stay focused on the hyper-local reporting?
I mean, it's what matters. I think filling an information, again, it goes back to like people see that green and white sign that goes up at the end of the street and it makes them angry, it makes them concerned. Where do you go? And part of my job, and I only get there maybe 20% of the time, is trying to demystify that. I remember early on in the Guelph Politico project, I had somebody email me and go like, can anyone go to city council meetings? And I was kind of taken aback by that. And I was yeah, of course. It's like, see what the start time is. And it's, you go in the front doors, it's at the end of the hall, take to the right, go in the door, it's unlocked, and there's a big 200-seat gallery for anyone who wants to go. And I think, I'm not saying this person was sort of willfully ignorant, but I think people don't fully appreciate that is something, like you can just go and sit down and watch what happens. Yeah. It's not gladiatorial. It's not scintillating. It's not entertaining always.
Yeah. Well, I've seen the sentiment expressed more and more lately of, wasn't it nice when politics was boring? Like when global politics was a little bit more boring, and this might be like and I was just a child at the time, but like the 90s of that, like post, like end of history, the world is now just like bureaucracy and boring.
I don't think people really believe that. I think that's something they want to tell themselves so they don't have to pay attention. But
yeah, that's fair. And I think that's
I once went to a town hall, and I'm not going to name the city councilor. They said, you should be able to, go about your life and not worry what we're doing at city, because it was about this motion that one of the councilors had dropped that had this neighborhood concern. And they said, you should be able to go about your lives and not worry about what city council is doing. And I was sitting on the floor because it was a packed house. I was sitting on the floor typing, and I kind of stopped and like, I understand your sentiment.
Yeah.
But that is not how we should be looking at the world. You can like your city councilor. I know all the city councilors. I like them. I'm friendly with them.
Mm-hmm.
I don't trust them.
Yeah.
And that's the way it should be. And
there's that innate sense of like the responsibility that they wield, right? It's kind of like, I don't know, you could compare it to like police officers or something where people are like, police officers they're held to such standards. Well, why shouldn't they? They're the ones who voluntarily chose to put themselves into the authority.
Right.
Shouldn't we
there's an advanced sense of responsibility to that, and you should be open to that scrutiny. And I remember like the blowback against the police in 2020 after George Floyd and all that. We saw that here and saw that expressed here. But I also, talked to somebody who, was as a young person was going through crises and was able to lean on a police officer, the school resource officer, as somebody who would like talk to them and listen to them. And I mean, it's the the defense police unions and people who are pro-police it's always a few bad apples. And I'm like, yeah, it's that phrase, the few bad apples spoil the bunch. And you have to hold to account the bad apples. Otherwise, it tars the whole organization.
Yeah. Yeah, I think you're right. The powers that be don't really have incentive to remind people about where power really lays. Like you were saying, people get really focused on federal politics that they think like, yeah, Trudeau's not even around anymore.
He's not even, well, he's around, but
he's around.
He's shopping at Canadian Tire, evidently.
But then there's like, they're just so focused on that. And I think Doug Ford, from an Ontario point of view, likes it that way. Sure. Because if the less people are aware of all the responsibilities that his government is or is not doing, then that leaves less frustration aimed at him, less like, and then I think to extend that like further, like what is the relationship between city governments and the province? Like I think I've heard some people say like, well, cities are, what's the word? Like they're sub departments of the provincial government.
They're creatures of the province.
Creatures of the province, yeah.
Which is true. It's like the power trickles down.
Yeah.
From structural wise speaking, and I wish we had this broader conversation, and we have an election on. Like, could we rejigger the system so that it's up? So like cities are delivering all these services. Maybe they shouldn't be. Yeah. Like maybe every city shouldn't be charged with its own like infrastructure. Like is the water treatment systems and the electricity systems of Guelph so different from Hamilton or Kitchener or Oakville?
Well, it's kind of the debate between efficiency versus resiliency. Yeah. And we seem, in a larger sense, like we're obsessed, or a lot of people are obsessed with trying to push governments to be run with the efficiency of a company. Yes. When it's like, okay,
which are not always efficient either.
Yeah, they're not always efficient, but also like, what are the goals of a company are usually to like maximize profits. Yeah. And the goals of a government, you could, I guess, debate that endlessly. Like, what is the intended goal of the government? But I don't think anyone would want it to be to like, well, first off, there's no revenue, quote unquote, for them to be. Right. I mean, there is, but there's not like, the goal isn't just do the, like, I
the
guess
city doesn't get 5 cents from every Guelph t-shirt, for example.
Yeah, exactly. And it just gets like, it gets kind of complicated where, like, good example, from a farming point of view, we have protectionist, we have a quota system for a lot of our, the way our farming operates. And that does make us less, quote unquote, efficient in a economic sense, because rather than just getting the produce or milk or wherever would be absolute cheapest, it props up small farms. It means that there's a quote unquote like resiliency. We are now reaping the benefits of that. Canada is, because our egg prices aren't skyrocketing like American egg prices, because they have fewer giant egg factories, egg farms, and that where they get shut down. They get like, so we acknowledge that like government shouldn't just be focused on efficiency. And I think that's to your point. Like if a lot of things that are currently administered at a federal or provincial level were administered at a city level, that would mean redundancy across the board of, are there multiple people with the same title at multiple cities that could be done by one person provincially? Maybe, but those individuals will be able to provide more catered services because each one of them is trying to handle a fewer number of unique situations, if that makes any sense. Like,
there's a couple of things going on. One of them is we're so afraid of trying something new because what if it's worse? Yeah. Or because it's different. I think there's such an allergy to doing something different because it is different. And the other thing is, I think to have these little fiefdoms that they have, they, if I'm voting for a new council system where there's 8 councillors, that means less of a chance for me to win again. And, that sounds terrible because it sounds like all our city councillors are sort of power hungry and power mad.
Well, that's the tragedy of politics, is that if there's a politician who is not power hungry at all, how do they acquire power in the first place?
This is it. Yeah.
And it almost becomes like an evolutionary system where like it's survival of the fittest. And I guess fit in the case of politics would be defined as ability to acquire power. Right. And it's like, well, for your politician to be effective, they have to have some degree of acquiring and hanging on to power. And the balance is like, how do they balance that?
There's this theory that all corruption is bad. I do not hold to that. If I'm a federal politician and I want X factory to set up in my town, so it creates 2,000 good paying jobs, and maybe I get like a little cheddar on the side for me for making it happen. I mean, again, I'm not saying I 100% believe this, but I'm what I'm questioning is it really that bad if I get a kickback for doing something good for the community? I mean, I think we look at all kickbacks as bad, but there used to be a time where politicians were crooked, cops were crooked, and it wasn't great for everybody, obviously, but we used to accept a little bit of corruption, and I'm not saying I want to bring that back, but
it also
it does make me wonder.
It kind of gets down into the definition again of like, well, one person's like direct kickback, that would be bad. Mm-hmm. However, if another person's point of view is like, hey, if I make this deal and this factory opens up in my town, and then my people in my town make more money, and then my city government has more taxes, and then my services improve, and then better restaurants open up, and like, you know what I mean? Like,
right.
That could make their life better. Like, it could raise their property values and make their life better, but in a purely like, well, yeah, that's what happens when you make your town a better place to live.
It's an interesting sort of like ethical argument. Is a little bit of corruption okay if the rising tide raises all ships?
Yeah.
Or is it better that like the water is stagnant and everybody is ethically moral? I'll leave that for listeners to decide, but it is a question I kind of toy with myself.
I'm fearful I'm going to go on another tangent here, but just talking about
this is a tangent show.
It is the idea of like, I often have this perspective where you look at history and it feels like there was all of these changes and new things happening, and obviously there's fundamental changes that happen in our society constantly. But why does it feel like the growth stopped in, like, we used to be, go back to the 1800s, like the establishment of Guelph, like the country was growing and new cities were being established, and the population, like say of Ontario, has grown so much. But why did we just go to just sprawl and densification instead of like, how does a person even, could a person or an organization start a new city? Does that concept even make sense anymore?
It's interesting.
You know what I mean? Like, why were we doing that? I understand the reason is like there was new forms of mechanization and industrialization that opened up opportunities.
And more land was available.
Was available. But like, I just don't. And I guess some of this is just like,
I mean, a lot of it
take
is
a course
comfort.
on colonialism and that, and like, you'll get a sense of it. But
a lot of it was like, we see it, we'll take it.
Yeah.
A lot of it too was, I think, we have certain expectations for what our life looks like now. Starting something is hard. Yeah. And you appreciate that as someone who started this podcast. I appreciate it as someone who started as like my various tentacles. Starting something is hard. Walking into something and taking advantage of what's already built is relatively easy.
Yeah.
And I think that speaks to a lot of this. We know our systems aren't working. There are a lot of people out there who are like, just tear it all down and something new will magically take its place. And I think as we're seeing in the United States right now, sometimes the thing that takes its place is kind of worse. Like, no matter how badly you think the system was working, it was working. Yeah.
So power vacuums are something to be, in a lot of cases, fearful of. I mean, it kind of goes to the idea of, like we were talking about, all the criticisms that one can levy at cops.
Right.
That's definitely true. Do I want to live in a city without cops?
This is the push-pull, right?
Yeah.
That I think we want cops to be responsive to sort of the greater social responsibility, but we also want to make sure that when we call 911, this is actually a great local argument, and Chief Kobe has said this a lot, like, you should not be calling the cops for a mental health emergency. Having said that, there's one phone number you call and somebody answers 24 hours a day, 7 days a week.
Yeah.
So, how do you circle those two squares? You either accept the fact that cops have a role in mental health, or you set up an entirely new system where it's like cops, but they're mental health workers. So you call like 111 and you get someone with a psychological degree,
and
or
you convince all your neighbors that their property taxes will go up X amount to pay for that. And it's like, so that's,
I mean, these are the big questions. And I think we get so busy living our everyday lives, we don't get as much of a chance. Like, what would that look like? What would an emergency responder for mental health look like? And I just it's tough to just stop for a minute and say, like, let's have a full-blown, let's like game this out, and who would you invite? And it's something so easy like having a citizens assembly. You'll hear a lot of people in this election like, let's have a citizens assembly about electoral reform. That's kind of low stakes stuff, like getting a bunch of people together to have this like grand conversation about how we elect politicians. It's never going to happen unless like there's a big, massive outcry from like, we want a citizens assembly, like people in the streets. But what do you think the odds are that's going to happen?
Yeah.
And if we can't do that for the, I don't think it's a penny ante issue, but if we can't do that for the penny ante stuff, we're certainly not going to do it like for, let's create an emergency responder for mental health, which is a massive thing.
And so much of this just depends on people being actively engaged in the process. And the modern world is so complicated and people have so many pressures facing them, like the 40+ hour work week, kids, like friends, family, sicknesses, everything that, you know, takes up time in people's lives.
Or just like fishing.
Yeah. And their hobbies and
video
games.
The
things that are the restful moments that our brains like desperately need.
Watching Reacher.
Exactly. And then you end up in a situation where like the people with the most time on their hands, time, money, education, power, get to contribute. And the people, the larger population tends to only really take notice when they're impacted. So when they're laid off by something, now suddenly, oh, you're laid off and you're like, maybe now you can go march in an anti-tariff march or something because you now have that freedom to do so.
That's right.
I guess this, this conversation ties into my my next question is about like, what are you find are the biggest challenges with getting people to care about local issues, and what strategies have you found that pull people in to really take a new look and to say like, oh, like I do care about this and I do have a vested interest in understanding.
Well, to pull people in, I think in most cases people don't get in until they see how it affects them. And I mean, it's also situational. Like people like deeply care about transit. They'll lean in when I'm talking about transit, or if I'm talking about housing, or people who are addicted to substances and their treatment.
Like the whole NIMBYism thing. It's not. It's not in my rented apartment building, but like there's an inherent like the ownership of things that people now say like, well, now that I own a piece of property on this street, like I care about this, and they you know what I mean. And there's that
motives are rarely unselfish. It's sad but true. But so I mean, a lot of it is situational in terms of, you know, how to address that. I think one of the things I come to terms with my work is when you're paying somebody to sit at a city council meeting to sort of cover it, a lot of stuff happens at city council that, you know, may not, you know, something like they're changing the procedural bylaw, which is, you know, how council operates, or something like, I'm trying to think of something kind of nebulous and non-concerning, like municipal, people are kind of concerned that, but there are things at city council that not everybody cares about, that are just kind of like
the nitty-gritty bureaucracy.
Like we're applying for this grant, or like we're appointing people to X committee or something. The people
who work or have a vested interest in that particular field might have opinions, but if you told most people, they'd say whatever, I guess you have to talk about it.
But as a reporter, like I'm sitting there like covering it all. That's an investment in the thing everybody cares about happens, whether that is $10 million missing or somebody being nakedly corrupt or nakedly authoritarian. There will come a point something like that happens. And I think we kind of forget that. It's like, oh, it's Guelph, everything's cool, everybody's cool. But there will come a day that something that gets everybody's attention happens. And the question everybody has to ask themselves is, will there anybody be sitting there in the press box the day that happens?
And if there, this, I've never worked in IT, but I've heard the sentiment of people who work in IT and like corporate settings where IT can often feel like the wider corporation around them has like one of two opinions of them, which is like, everything's working, why are we paying you people? And then the other side is, everything's broken, why are we paying you people? And when everything is just going well, because they are keeping the lights on, keeping things moving, there's this like out of sight, out of mindness. And that's, I think there's an analogy there, like to what you just said, right? Where if you don't have that system in place, then you don't have the resiliency to get the stories out, get the things out, and you can't start doing it at that point because how will you even know? Like, how will you know the server's down if there's no one keeping an eye on the server? Like,
and there will be it comes out. It always comes out, and there will be the immediate reaction of, why didn't we know about this?
Yeah,
it's because like nobody was there, like filing the FOI requests and seeing an item on the agenda, going, what's that about? Mm-hmm. Because you see all the agendas, and so when something sticks out like a sore thumb, when something just doesn't look right. I heard this from talking to a community health advocate. Hospitals should be big, beautiful buildings that no one ever uses, because ideally you want that big, beautiful building ready to receive people in an emergency. But in a perfect world, your health is so well taken care of that there really is you don't all of a sudden like have a heart attack, and you theoretically a doctor should have caught the possibility of you having a heart attack.
Yeah, and this kind of goes back to the idea of people thinking that government should operate on being as lean as possible, like the way corporations do, where it's like, yeah, but if a corporation can't meet demand, then if Nintendo can't make enough Switch 2s to sell, then it's like, okay, well, their shareholders won't make as much money. But if a hospital can't fit all of its patients in beds, then suddenly it's not just a lack of earnings opportunity for them. It becomes like a citizens dying on the streets.
If Google and Facebook don't sell enough ads to make their quota this quarter, it doesn't necessarily affect. I mean, it does if I'm a Google employee or a Meta employee, but for me as a Google user, if I see fewer ads, I'm not going. It doesn't hurt me. Mm-hmm. But I mean, if my city hall doesn't work, that could definitely hurt me. And there have been times where people have gotten hurt because of city hall negligence or killed.
So I guess this next part of are there good solutions that are proposed for solving I guess the crisis of like local journalism? And so the biggest problem that we have is that like newspapers, local newspapers, local radio, and that used to be robust because they used to be more powerful because they were the only game in town.
Sure.
They had people's attention, so therefore job postings, advertisements, all of that flowed through that. Now, so much of that has gone to the internet, but when you pay for a Facebook ad, that money goes to Facebook.
Yeah.
It doesn't go to your local town like newspaper. It doesn't go to like. So how do we?
Go some more karate lessons from Mark Zuckerberg.
How do we solve for that? And is that what I mean? I suppose that's kind of what the Canadian government was trying to do when they said, "Hey, Meta, like you're profiting off of our work, not the work of journalists."
Right.
And then Meta just took their ball and went home. Is there perhaps a world where a portion of everyone's internet bill goes towards supporting local journalism? Or like I think that there are things that maybe we should be exploring that we're not at the moment, or at least not.
Yes. No, I completely agree. I think the government of Canada missed the mark on a lot of things with the Online News Act. Number one is the failure to recognize that part of the problem was like the mergers and acquisitions and building these massive media companies, whether we're talking about Bell, whether we're talking about Post Media. Part of that too is failing to create mechanisms. Like in the United States, you can, like the Texas Tribune, for example, is a nonprofit. You can establish a nonprofit as a media outlet, and you would be governed by the same rules as any nonprofit. It's just that your charity is news and delivering the news. We don't have that mechanism in Canada. I think that would change the game a lot.
Is that the case where in Canada, like there's nonprofits and then there's news media and there's
no provision in the laws to set up nonprofit corporations for you can set up to deliver food, hampers, or collect funds for cancer research, but you can't set up a nonprofit to be a news outlet. You can set one up to be like a think tank or something.
Right.
Something news adjacent. And then
something
maybe you
produces articles.
Like the Broadband Center, for example. Press Progress is connected to the Broadband Center.
Right.
But Press Progress is not a nonprofit that collects funds for the delivery of news. Something like that would change the game. I think it also comes down to accepting that the old ways are going away we are going back to sort of an 18th century, 19th century where there are partisan news outlets.
Yeah.
Everybody has like this whole idea that news is this objective island in a sea of partisanship. That's a very like late 20th century thing that, we're going backwards in a sense, that we have to have an informed population that understands that media literacy piece we've been talking about. And also people have to, and this is part of the fault of the industry. Media got this idea in the 90s, the late 90s when the internet erupted. We'll just put all our content online and then it'll be fine. Like we'll figure out the rest later.
Yeah.
And then a generation later, a whole group of people have got used to free information online for the news. And then at that point, it became so precarious. Like, well, now we have to like put up paywalls and stuff, which people immediately, like still to this day, disregard. People hate paywalls.
Yeah.
And it's like, well, gotta make money somehow.
It's a tendency I find myself fighting against too, because I born in 91, so for me, like if I want to see a movie, like I'm aware, like I can go pay for a ticket in the thing, I can do this, I can do that, like, or I can download it for free off the internet.
Yeah.
And that does feel like a little bit different. Like there is maybe some kind of moral difference between like, oh, I'm 14 and I don't have a job and I want to watch the movie Fight Club. Yeah, download the torrent of it. But like if I'm like in my 30s and I have access to money to buy it,
if I have disposable income.
Yeah, but then it becomes like, and then that same thing has happened with music and like every form of media, and it's
except those forms were like way more adaptable. Like,
right.
iTunes
because
comes
there still
out
is that
iTunes comes out a couple of years after Napster changes the game, and it like iTunes didn't solve the matter of illegal downloading, but it did have an equalizing effect. And it was never figured out for news, though. No. That's the thing.
And there's people who have proposed platforms for it. Like there's I only noticed an iPhone app. There's a Substack people use for things that it's kind of in that. I guess it's not quite in that model, but like I wonder if there's a space for something, I guess, similar to like YouTube Premium. Like I pay for YouTube Premium. I watch a lot of YouTube. A portion of my YouTube Premium payment is distributed equally amongst the people based off of how much I watch of them.
Right.
If I could pay $8 a month for Newsify, and Newsify was a platform that journalists could publish to, and then a good portion of my subscription fee was distributed amongst the journalists whose content I like. That like
you're right, but I got to tell you, anyone who's a musician who is on Spotify will tell you that they do not. If they're if you're Taylor Swift, you probably make a lot of money on Spotify.
Yeah.
But if you're
so it's like
small band X from Guelph, Ontario, you're probably not making.
I guess that's where could there be a system that actually distributes those, like where someone creates a platform that can be open source, hosted on various servers, so it's not just the corporation of Spotify that's making the profit. And then once you have that platform in space, like platform set up, then a much smaller percentage of the fee can go towards the maintenance of the platform, and the rest can actually be distributed, and so that you wouldn't just have like the top 1% artists that make everything at the.
I suppose hypothetically, I'm a big believer, though. You want local solutions. It has to come from the local level. News has to be something that matters to you. And if getting local news matters, it matters enough that you can, like, to help support me. I don't ask for a lot. I ask for a couple of bucks a month. If what Guelph Politico does matters to you.
Well, this is a perfect time to, I think, segue into that.
Sure.
If people who have been eagerly listening and saying, like,
if they made it this far.
Yeah. If they're saying to themselves, like, hey, yeah, that's me. I'm the person interested in local news. And I would think it would be very rare for someone who's interested in local Guelph news who, like, doesn't know you and your name. Yeah. But, for example, say someone's new to being involved in local politics and stuff in Guelph, where would you direct them to?
I have on my website, guelphpolitico.ca/donate, there's a list of options. I take regular old snail mail paper checks. I take PayPal donations, regular donations. I have a Patreon site. I do have Substack, which I am going to be adding a payment option at some point. Like, all of Guelph Politico content is free, and I fully believe that. Putting up a paywall is essentially information is power, and I do not want to disarm people. I want to make sure if you are concerned about something and you Google the issue and my site comes up, you get access to it and you don't hit a paywall. I think that is super, super important. So it's a completely voluntary system, and because of that, every little bit helps. And even if you're someone who is not benefited financially, shall we say, there are ways like just subscribing to the feeds that helps the metrics, leaving reviews, rating. There are all sorts of things you can do to help boost the signal, as it were. So yeah, I do firmly believe that local solutions come from local people, and local people saying that something matters to them. So,
well, I would agree, and I think that's an admirable stance to take on it. I guess my final question or topic to dive into is what do you think the future of local Guelph journalism looks like? And do you see people coming down the I want to say down the pipe, but I think the phrase is down the pike, right? Technically, but
I think so.
People coming down the pike who are eager to like follow in your footsteps, or to like, is there that space there, and how could you encourage that? Like, what are your thoughts on that?
I think there's room for everybody. I think I don't have advice so much as wanting to make people aware that because when the Mercury closed, there were a number of people who were like, I'm going to replace the Mercury. And there was a whole Facebook group. I can't remember who set it up or what it was called, but they were like, we're setting up this Facebook group that's going to cover city council meetings and talk to the city councilors and get to the bottom of issues. It was gone in a couple of months because it is work.
Yeah.
You can know the name of every city councilor and know them by their face and know what ward they are, but that's half the room. That's half. There's an entire staff apparatus, and that's always constantly changing. And you're walking into issues that have been chewed over in some cases like 20 years. You have to learn new acronyms and learn new procedures, and that's the hard part. And I would encourage anyone who wants to learn, like, go to just start going to the meetings, whether you watch it online or go in person. You'll pick it up as you go, and that's how I learned. What does this look like in the years to come? I wish I could say. If I could predict the future, I'd be rich. But I think there is lots of opportunity. There's lots of, like, you don't have to do what I do. If you want to, set up a TikTok dedicated to council stuff, I would encourage that. If you want to do a YouTube series where you're interviewing, local city councilors, I would encourage that. If you want to start your own political podcast, CFRU is a great resource because you get that training and audio production. You take the orientation course, you take the technical courses. It's like maybe 10 hours in altogether, and you pitch your show and away you go. And
I know it's come up in conversation a few times, but just for any listener who doesn't know, CFRU is the local University of Guelph radio station.
Based out of the University of Guelph, 93.3.
Yeah, 93.3.
93.3 FM. It's been there for 50, almost 60 years. Still going strong. There are a lot of young people who are involved at CFRU. There's a group who've produced a show, CFRU Live, where it's got a YouTube component where we have a media studio at CFRU where they have a green screen set up. So a band goes in there, sets up, and they have a weird, wacky green screen backgrounds as they're playing music. And there's an interview portion where you're getting to know a local band or a local-ish band. So there are a lot of really great opportunities at CFRU. If you don't I understand like the technical stuff is probably the big barrier for a lot of people.
Yeah. But there are, I'm saying this as someone who's using and I've talked about this before, I'm using an audio board that I rent from the Tool Library, and I've rented it like 10 plus
Tool
times
Library
now.
is a great resource. Yeah.
And like the Tool Library has, if you want to get into this, if you don't have the funds for it, the Tool Library may have opportunities for like community assisted memberships.
That's right. Yeah.
And they have all the tools at your, like, if you don't have to go spend $1,000,
no,
you probably can get away with the phone in your pocket. And if that's not good enough, then there are so many interesting resources out there for people.
You can get away with like a podcast, like USB podcast kit for like $30.
Yeah.
And and then there's a makerspace in the Westminster branch of the library that has a podcast set up. So there are a lot of, like, people can help you overcome the tech barriers.
Yeah.
I think what the message I want to leave people with is, like, if you have something important to say and you want to say it, don't wait for anyone to tell you it's okay. Just get out there. And, great things come from people who say, here's my soapbox. I'm standing on my soapbox. I have something important to say. I mean, I hope somebody younger comes up and maybe even surpasses me. I think that'd be great. I'm doing my thing, and I didn't shut the door behind me. The door is open if anyone wants to follow in behind me, and they're more than welcome.
Well, that is a good place to leave things, I think. And thanks so much for joining me.
Oh,
today.
thank you.
This was a good conversation. I think we went on some tangents, but it was all, related to the bigger question of how we find out about the world around us.
Yes.
So I guess I didn't even ask this question. Like, is my podcast journalism? Like, it's not.
Sure.
I wouldn't say it's exactly, but it's. I don't know. We'll see if I get enough attention that Meta closes all my accounts. But
You're not a journalist, so you've been banned by Meta, apparently. But
that's
a sad reflection of our times, I think.
All right. Well, there'll be links in the show notes to all the things that we talked about, the different shows that you have.
Appreciate it.
Yeah. Thanks so much.
Thanks, Jordan.
Thanks for listening to Growing Guelph. I've been your host, Jordan Sloggett. Be sure to subscribe to us on social media, on your favorite podcast app, and if you have a recommendation for a future guest you'd like me to speak to, you can reach out to me at growingguelph@gmail.com.